Mr. Commissioner, just before we broke, you asked us about a joint project agreement, and Canada has brought a copy of an example of one from 2009, which I think a copy has been put on your desk or will be passed up to you through Mr. Lunn. Thank you. And Mr. Ryle, you have a copy of that?
Yes, I have a copy of the agreement.
All right. And this is an example of a joint project agreement that basically sets out how the test fisheries will be implemented in a given year, right?
Yes, it provides detail on the work plan, what those test fisheries will start and stop as a plan, what sort of information will be collected, who's responsible for what between the two parties, DFO and the PSC.
And it includes not just sockeye, but all of the species where data is collected and fisheries are conducted. Yes,
it does. I mean, to further complicate this picture a little bit anyhow, I've only mentioned two parties, but there is a third party involved in here, the BC Wild Harvest Salmon Producers Association, that we enter into the agreement as well, that operate or minister test fisheries that are not Fraser River sockeye and pink salmon. Within the Pacific region, BC and Yukon, there are test fisheries that are operated in the Yukon, on the Skeena River.
But for our purposes in this Commission of Inquiry, that's probably one bit of information we don't need to worry too much about. Is that fair?
Well, I think it comes up in another instance where you're asking questions about funding as well, and we could go that direction now or wait till you start to ask about it. Is the reason that I raised those other test fisheries as well. Okay.
Well, for now, let's just leave it, and I'll have this marked, I guess, as the next exhibit if I could.
Exhibit number 367.
367?
That's correct.
And it's CAN 065910. Thank you. And then just before we broke, we were talking about a meeting that was, or a presentation, I guess, that was done by the ADM of Science to the DMC. And DMC again stands for what?
DMC stands for Departmental Management Committee, and it has senior management, and it's chaired by the Deputy Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Provided with a PowerPoint presentation that I understand was made at that meeting by the ADM Science. It should be in front of you on the screen. Is that the presentation?
Yes, that is the presentation.
Okay. Now, there's been some redactions in this document. Basically, all of the options appear to be redacted. Why is that?
Are you asking me why they've been redacted?
Yeah. What was it?
And is that a question for me, or?
I'm just curious. Like, what has? I don't want him to tell me what the content was, but what were on these pages that were blacked out? What are we missing? Just so we understand.
Mr. Commissioner, the LAROC working group had participation of DFO Legal Services, and their role was to help analyze the consequences of the decision. And so there was legal advice incorporated into the presentation made to the DMC, and Canada is asserting solicitor-client privilege over some content of the deck.
Right. So were options presented as to how test fisheries would be funded in the face of LAROC? Is that what this was about?
Well, the deck was to provide what the cost implications are for the department on a national, and you'll see there's a number of graphs in the deck, and trying to look forward about what sort of options there may be.
All right. In a document, which is at tab 3 of the materials in front of you, which is CAN. At the bottom it says number 4, post-LAROC APPFA test fishing alternatives you'll see some options set out, and they carry on to the next page where DFO would pay all costs, industry would pay costs, etc. There are 3 options. Are those the kinds of options that were put forward at that meeting?
I don't think they were in that particular detail, but I mean also within the minutes of the DMC, which is in another tab here, talked about guidance that came from the Departmental Management Committee into looking into options into the future.
Those are in Canada's documents at tab 2. Is that right? Mr. Lunn, can you find it, document number 2 on Canada's list? right. Is this what you're referring to? It's on the screen now, Mr. Ryle.
Yes, that's what I'm referring to.
All right. That was a little bit faster. We should make use of these electronic tools. All right.
So further down in that document, there is a summary of the meeting. It's pretty brief.
This is Lower Rock decision and update.
Yes, point 4. So the Deputy Minister asked DMC and a policy lead to develop a policy framework on who pays for science advice. I mean, really, there's a number of options here. One is that the department pays for test fishing. The other is that it be done in a manner of collaborative manner, which is the other policy document that we were just looking at that laid out options, that it could be a joint operation between DFO and industry to fund these types of arrangements. It was thought, and as well as that, this would take time to work that option of joint projects. Would take some time to develop, and that's alluded to in the previous document that we were just looking at. You know, the other option as well in this is to go back to use of fish. And that was considered and implemented into a draft of the Fishery Act that was tabled to Parliament. That was, well, that was not accepted by Parliament. I'm not saying not because of use of fish, but overall it was, that Fishery Act was, the changes were not finalized.
I'll have the minutes that are in front of us now marked as a next exhibit, and then following that, I'd like the policy document marked as a following exhibit.
The first document would be 368.
So what is the first document?
It's this one that's on the screen. It's the minutes of the meeting.
Thank you.
The second document would be 369.
And this is departmental policies and guidelines developed in response to the LaRock and APPFA federal court decisions 2008. And that is, sorry, what exhibit is that?
369.
At the bottom, the options that you just summarized there are DFO pays all costs, industry pays the costs for data collection or collects data during normal commercial fishing opportunities. The second and third one is DFO and industry partner together cooperatively. Those were your options. And then the fourth one was the continue to use fish.
Which would require a legislative change.
Okay. Looking at the PowerPoint presentation, which I don't, has this been marked? Which has not yet been marked, but it's the PowerPoint presentation that was provided by Canada this morning. And I should probably mark this, please, as the next exhibit.
370.
All right, thank you. 370. If you turn to page 11 of Exhibit 370, it sets out specific cost analysis findings, risk analysis. What was the risk analysis that was done at that time?
Well, the previous page, looks like 9, gives you an indication of the risk analysis we're looking at on test fisheries.
Can you, yeah, I have looked at those briefly, but they didn't provide enough information for me to understand what the risk analysis was, so that's why I'm asking if you can give me some more information on that.
Well, we were looking at what the risk would be if we did not undertake those test fisheries as far as gathering that stock assessment information. And so would it have an impact on conservation, for example? Or was it being used for other purposes? Some of the programs that were being operated pre-LaRock could have been information that would have been helpful, but was more primarily being run for purposes of gathering information for industry as far as economic value, and really not being run for conservation purposes and gathering stock assessment information, as much as we've talked about here this morning about gathering in-season run size information and other pertinent pieces that would manage the fishery. So that was the one of the types of risk analysis that was undertaken.
All right, so if you go back, if you could, to page 11 of that document, for the Pacific region, where each of these species, which are shown in the right-hand column, analyzed all the test fishing programs for each of those species, analyzed as to whether they would have an impact on some of the issues you just described. I'm still not really clear what the risk analysis was.
Well, I guess what I was saying is, for example, could be a program that's undertaken to determine whether herring roe is at a good quality, for example, that has a higher economic value, well, that doesn't really impact upon whether we should harvest those fish or not because of conservation reasons. It really impacts upon whether that's the right time to harvest those fish or not. Our view is that that's more driven by an economic analysis than it is a conservation analysis about what the actual stock is.
Or what
So
was-
that's the distinction I was making in what telling risk analysis.
Right. What was the risk analysis that was performed in relation to Fraser River sockeye?
Similar type of analysis.
And what was the outcome of that analysis?
Well, the outcome of that analysis was that the test fisheries that we're operating for Fraser River sockeye and pink salmon are very important for the management of Fraser River sockeye and pink salmon. And that, as I was speaking to earlier this morning, that we need those test fisheries to operate to gather this information to properly manage Fraser River sockeye and pink salmon.
Right. Were any of the test fishing programs that were operated at that time, 2006, changed as a result of this risk analysis going forward?
No, this was providing guidance about what sort of requirements would be to nationally to operate test fishing programs, whether it be in the Pacific or Atlantic. As we talked about earlier as well, there's a whole process that comes up with outlining what a test fishing program is going to be for each year on an annual basis, depending on what's returning. So then you make some decisions on what needs to operate.
All right. Was this this was a presentation that was done as a result of a review of all test fisheries, and was it designed to plan for the next year or to set priorities for the future in general, or was it set for a 5-year plan, or what was the context of this meeting?
Well, the context of this meeting was to gather all this information. This was let me backtrack. Since the decision came down in 2006, it was that the department did not have the authority to use fish to pay for this type of service. Did not mean it didn't have the authority to collect this information. It had to do it in a different manner as far as payment for those services. And the intent of this was to figure out across all the problems across Canada, all the programs across Canada, what were those programs and what was the end use of that information. And to categorize it here as we've done into a risk analysis of red, yellow, and green to give an indication if we were going to now be responsible for paying for these services within the department or those other options that we talked about here, using payments either from DFO or industry. How were we going to move ahead in the short term? And as a result, it provided guidance to develop a submission to Treasury Board to seek funds for 5 years to operate test fisheries till a longer-term solution could be developed.
Okay. And do I read this graph pie chart on the left-hand side of the page 11 as indicating that the bulk of the test fishing costs were paid for? How can I say this? The bulk of the high likelihood, high impact test fisheries in the Pacific region were being at that time paid for by catch, by industry in that sense?
Well, when this analysis was done, all these test fisheries were operated through use of fish. I mean, there could have been some contributions, but the majority of those funds were through use of fish.
Right, but this, just reading this graph, is it saying here this circle represents all of the funding that's essentially provided by industry through the sale of fish?
Well, this is the interpretation I would put on this graph on the left side, where it's colored red and it has these are in millions, so $10.5 million. In our view, those are high likelihood and impact and at risk and have impacts on conservation. The other ones, where it says yellow, is about 900,000, and then low impact and is 354,000.
Right. And why is it described as industry contributions to science programs?
Good question. Really, this is, at the time, it's use of fish, and probably that's not the best label that should be on there as far as industry contributions. These are use of fish, and I was thinking back to this, it would be at that time, this use of fish would come off the TAC overall, and more appropriately, probably shouldn't say industry contribution.
Okay. But it represents the value of the test fishing program, I guess, that was funded by the sale of fish. And
That's
then it's
correct.
allocated between high impact, medium impact, and low impact.
That's correct.
All right. Following the presentation to the DMC, was a presentation made to Treasury Board for funding? I think you described this already.
I don't know if this was presented or not.
No,
I
I
was
asked.
not involved that part.
No, but was there, ultimately, there was a presentation made to Treasury Board
Yeah,
for funding test
that's
fisheries?
correct, there was.
Okay. Following this meeting.
Yes.
And out of that, there was a policy to fund test fisheries for 5 years, is that what you said?
Well, the decision was to provided funding to DFO to operate test fisheries nationally, it was an envelope of money with $10 million in the first year and $12 million thereafter. And those are, I'm talking national dollars here, not coming to Pacific region. Within the Pacific region, it was about 50%. About 10 of that money came to Pacific region because we're a large region and we have a lot of these programs within Pacific region. So roughly, I guess it was about $5 million in the first year that came to Pacific region to conduct these stock assessment programs, and about $5.5 million thereafter. But that's to do all species, not just salmon. That was to do everything as indicated on here. It covered, these programs covered everything from gooey duck, groundfish, halibut, herring, crab, rockfish, stablefish, salmon, sea cucumber, shrimp. My point is that that $5 million was to cover all those programs.
Right.
And out of that, I would say about 1.2 to 1.6 is my recollection would go to salmon, and out of that amounts of funds, I would say roughly half would end up being contained within the joint project agreement that would go to operate Fraser River sockeye and pink salmon programs.
All right, and this funding was called LaRock Relief Funding?
Yes, that's terminology. Yes, this would be the last year.
And why was funding only committed to for 5 years?
Well, as I was talking earlier, there was the idea that this was to be until a longer-term solution was found, which was the direction that came from the DMC committee back November 1st, 2006. So here is funding for 5 years while a longer-term solution is developed. It could be any of those options that we were talking about earlier, and the other one as well that's not listed in this policy document about use of fish, as I mentioned, was put in amendments to the Fishery Act that were tabled as well.
Okay.
I mean, you really get down to those types of options. Our view, going back into why these programs are important and why they operate without TAC as well is important, I think, as well, is that they provide in-season information about the health of the stock, whether it's providing us run size information or stock ID information, where those fish are migrating, that manage fisheries that are going to impact on them, whether those fisheries are First Nations FSC fisheries, commercial fisheries, or recreational. And without that information, we don't have the information to manage these fisheries.
Okay. Has the department decided what it will do after this relief funding ends in 2011?
Well, I've been off this file for a little bit, so I don't know exactly what sort of options might be contemplated at this point. There had been some work done earlier around those 4 options when I was involved, but I don't know the exact standing at this point in time.
It's fair to say, though, that you are not aware of an agreed upon proposal or an agreed upon solution that will take place after the 2011 funding expires.
It would be, yes, I would agree with that I'm not aware that there is an agreed upon solution, but, I mean, this is also not just a Pacific region issue. This is a national issue, As you know, as you can see, as I talked about, Pacific Region does about 50% of the cost of this, but so the other 50. My point is that it's going to be a national policy. It won't be a made in BC solution, I don't think.
All right. How is the national, while this relief funding is in place, who makes the decision as to how those funds will be allocated within the Pacific region?
Well, there's a national working group that has membership from all the regions. It has representatives from our science branch and our fisheries and aquaculture management branch that will get together on a more than an annual basis. But so each year, right now, we have $12 million. So for 2011, there's $12 million nationally that's available to operate programs across the country. After 4 years, things have kind of settled down into what I mean settled down into a more of an operating type. So each region pretty much knows what they're going to get on an annual basis. But things change each year, and so these funding pressures will come up. The National Committee will get together and ask if there's been any changes from the previous year from your requirements. If there has, then how are we going to deal with those funding pressures? In preparation for that national working group, the regional groups will get together and outline all the different programs that they need to operate in a year, whether it's Fraser River sockeye or geoducks or groundfish or halibut or so on. That's then discussed in this national working group and come to agreement about what the regional allocation will be of that $12 million.
All right, and who in the region actually makes the decisions on where the funds go?
Well, it's not quite a linear fashion. We talked earlier this morning about a test fishing plan gets developed through the Fraser River panel. That test fishing plan goes through the panel and gets finally approved after some discussion about what's required. That information is provided to the Financial Administration Committee that's also within the Pacific Salmon Commission. And that is reported to the Commission about what the financial obligations will be for the parties, and then is approved by the Commission as far as what will happen as far as dollars will be provided to operate test fishing programs.
So for Fraser River sockeye, is the decision-making process in the first instance at the Fraser River panel level and then the Commission level? And once the Commission has made its decision, does it go to Canada for further approval? I know that Canada is part of the Commission, but does it go to a different place in Canada for final approval, or once the Commission has approved the test fishing budget, is that binding in essence on Canada?
Well, I would say it's binding on Canada to deliver that program. But the reason I raised this back and forth discussion is that I know in 2008, for example, there was, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. had provided $200,000 roughly in 2007, and were not able or willing, I don't recall the details, but they were not going to provide those funds in 2008 and on for various reasons. And there was also discussion at that time about looking at whether we were going to modify test fisheries within Fraser River sockeye, and the outcome of that is going back to the panel process of looking at what's needed to operate. The final outcome of all this, though, is a bilaterally agreed test fishing program and what the obligations of the parties, whether it's Canada or the U.S., to operate.
When you talk about the funding that you've just spoken to, you're addressing not just the test fisheries that you described earlier on the map that you showed me, but you're also talking about Mission and Quailark as well, is that correct?
That F&A committee will look at the whole budget for the Pacific Salmon Commission, and test fishing being one component of
and
that.
The hydroacoustic element is part of that consideration?
It'll be another part of the consideration as well as other aspects that the PSC funds as well. The F&A committee will look at the whole package.
I see.
Does the PSC approve the costs of Quailark?
No, the PSC does not approve the cost of Quailark. That's with a departmental program.
Right. So there's some programs that are simply dealt with by DFO outside of the PSC. Quailark would be one. Is there any others?
For Fraser River sockeye?
Yes.
Absolutely. You mean as far as test fishing goes?
Yes.
in particular. There's programs that have operated under the Southern Endowment Fund, that goes back to the PSC, and I think in 2008 or 9 there was a feasibility study as.
Sorry, if I can just interrupt. I'm asking about programs that are funded by DFO, not funded by the Southern Endowment Fund, and that are
Yes.
test fishing programs, not stock assessment programs or anything like that, just test fishing programs.
Yeah, well, the one I was going to raise was a test fishing program at Siska, which is just downstream of Lytton. There was a fish wheel feasibility study done there. There's also been some.
Sorry, but was that funded by the Southern Endowment Fund?
That
or was
one
that,
was,
so it wasn't a DFO-funded project?
No, that's correct. And then I was going to also mention that there have been fish wheel programs in the Lower Fraser that have received funding from a variety of sources, some from DFO and some from other sources as well.
Okay. But the test fishing programs, the marine area test fishing programs that we talked about earlier this morning, those are all approved through the PSC process, correct?
All the ones we talked about this morning, that is correct.
And if I can ask you to turn to tab 1 in Canada's documents, or Mr. Lund can pull it up on the screen, perhaps it might be simpler. This document sets out test fishing program funding from Canada. The first page is 2009 to 2010, but if you turn through the document, it goes back to 2007-8 is the first funding year, I think. There. Oop. Yeah, stop there. And that shows the funding. This is the first program funding that was approved after the LaRock came in. Is that right?
Yes, 2007 was the first year.
And it shows a total funding of. I'll just ask you to point out to me where. Show me on, if you could, on this document where the total funding provided by Canada shows.
Well, the line labeled Canadian contribution under panel areas of 200,000 would be the first part. And then under non-panel areas where it says Canadian contribution of 265,000 would be the second part. And just add a complication to all this where it's labeled BC WHSPA funds, a further $22,200 would also be DFO funds as well.
And what is the line that says PSC test fishing? What's that? Is that showing the amount that was spent
I would
on
assume
PSC?
that I haven't added these numbers up, but it seems to me that adds up to. And the other part is the 200,000, or excuse me, the U.S. contribution of 198,000 roughly, up at the top under panel areas. So the 419,000.
That's the portion that is simply allocated to PSC test fisheries. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I haven't added these up. Do you see, Jim?
397
Yeah.
plus the 22 equals the 420.
Yeah, perfect. There you go. Jim knew the answer.
7 plus the.
Yes, the
22.
397 plus the 22,000 comes to the
All right.
420.
And what for non-panel waters, 265? That is not considered a PSC test fishery, and that's why we separate it out from the total.
I think that's the reason, yes.
Okay. And then if you go to the 2008-9 year, we see the number is now 665,390 for PSC test fishing.
Yes.
And then in the current year, or the past year, sorry, 2009 to 2010, the number is. Now, when I read this document, I was sort of struggling with this because it looked like the number had gone way down. Can you explain to me, is 251 the total PSC test fishing payment from Canada in the 2009-10 year, or is it the 705,000 that you see to the?
Actually, I think it's the combination of the two. I think where it says contributions, and I say think, I actually didn't put this table together, and it was put together through the PSC that are administering the funds, but my understanding of this is that where it says Canada's contributions that total up 706,000 roughly, it came from fiscal year 2009, 2010, where it says contributions that add up to $251,000 as a requirement to find some additional funds to fund test fishing programs in 09, 010. That was also provided. So roughly 951,000, but we would need to confirm that.
All right, do you have any information on that, Mr. Cave?
This is probably a document that we had put together in part, and I think it looks to me that there's a carryover from the 2008 season, Paul, which is why that $152,438 looks to me to be a carryover.
That's the way I was reading it.
Yeah, yeah, and also there's a small contribution from the PSC revolving fund in that year as well, which is there was a budget shortfall.
What is the PSC revolving fund?
Well, there's a fund that was pre-LaRock, if I may, where it was capped at $500,000 by the Finance and Administration Committee of the Pacific Salmon Commission to in years where there was insufficient fish to fund the program or conservation concerns, that fund could be used. It has been used only occasionally in a limited extent. And because it was generated pre-LaRock by fish sales, there's been a reluctance to use it. And it requires bilateral, I believe, bilateral approval to access those funds.
Does that fund still exist?
Yes. And I believe it is fully topped up to the $500,000. But I can't, I'm not certain of that.
All right, I'd like this document, please, marked as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 371.
I think I touched on this question earlier, but if we could just go back. Has there been any impact on the Fraser River sockeye test fisheries from the loss of fish sales in the test fishing program? Has that impacted the test fishing program of the PSC? And I'll ask that to Mr. Cave to start.
We've managed to retain our core programs. There have been some changes. There's been a considerable discussion on this subject. We've managed to retain our core test fisheries, such as the purse seine, the marine purse seine, the marine gillnet, the river gillnet test fisheries. There has been some of the days where we had days of overlap between the Area 12 and within the Area 12 and within the Area 13 purse seine test fisheries. Those have been removed. And those have removed some flexibility to fund other initiatives. For example, some of the radio tagging work that was carried on by LGL. We were able to fund some of those activities through sale of fish. We're no longer able to do so. So as part of the test fishing program, when they've had to do marine tagging, they've had to find those funds themselves. There has been some removal of some of the fishing time from the river gillnet test fisheries as well. And but by and large, we've been able to maintain our core programs, but it's been the subject of some discussion.
Have there been impacts to other non-sockeye fisheries?
By non-sockeye fisheries, you're referring to pink or?
Chum, pink, others.
I can't speak to those other species.
Mr. Rowell, can you?
There has been some impact on some of the other species, I would say.
There was a chum fishery in Johnson Strait which has been eliminated, is that right?
Well, it was eliminated and for a couple of years, but it has been restarted, and one needs to look at these whole things in a whole comprehensive package. Bottom line to me, though, is that each year that when we go through and trying to determine what we need to do as an annual test fishing program is what are the priorities and what are the needs to meet to do the assessment. There has been, I would say, some impact on some of the other species, though, just as a summary.
Right, and Mr. Esu, have you got anything to add to that?
I don't think I have any more to add to what Paul has said.
Ms. Baker, could I, just again for clarification, either Mr. Cave or Mr. Rowell, to the extent that the test fisheries contribute to the process of forecasting and escapement information that's supplied to the Pacific Salmon Commission, are the numbers you're talking about within these numbers, or in other words, to the extent that DFO is using test fisheries to develop pre- and in-season information with respect to escapement or forecasting, are the costs associated with that all part of the numbers you've been talking about, or is there another set of numbers?
No, like these 3 fiscal years that we've been looking at are incorporated in these tables. And the reason that there's not one for 2010 and 11 is that they're still gathering information to complete that one. But as far as, I think as well, the question, I think maybe you're asking as well as were there any impacts on test fisheries as far as the assessment capabilities, either in quantity or quality. I think, as Jim was saying, that we have retained and continue to operate test fisheries to gather the information, provide the assessment that we need to manage Fraser sockeye and pink salmon. I would say, having said that, though, this is not a static thing, whether it's use of fish or whether it's use of dollars to pay for these services. If we go back into history when we were using use of fish to pay for the services of gathering this information, that amount went up over the years, and I think at the last amount, so we were harvesting probably about 110,000 sockeye, Jim, is in that order. I think in recent years we're probably between 30 and 40,000 sockeye, so we've made this change because of the we've reduced the impact on the overall stock, but we still are killing fish, 30 to 40,000 on average, I would guess. But whether it was use of fish or dollars, when we go back to use of fish, that came off the overall total allowable catch. This has an impact on other people, and they're watching this very carefully. There's always this trade-off. You can gather more information, but it's going to be a cost. And it's a cost in money or it's a cost in fish. And so how far, if you harvest more fish, use of fish to pay for those test fisheries, then it's going to have an impact on the resource. So, you know, you got to balance what your information needs are against the costs that you're undertaking as well. So whether, you know, we were looking at use of fish or dollars each year, we would be looking at these test fishing programs very carefully about what do we need to provide a program to run and gather this information, and what's the impact going to be, and how are we going to make those judgments and go through the whole process of having those discussions within the Fraser River panel and coming up with the agreed test fishing program. I think there are personally benefits to use of fish as far as putting the obligation on the resource. It's used as I mentioned as well, around conservation. We're not just making these decisions around whether a commercial fishery operates or not. It's a matter of, well, as access for First Nations fisheries as well. And one needs to gather this type of information.
Mr. Cave?
Just to clarify that the test fishing budget is administered separately from the other budgets. It's not hydroacoustics, it's not part of an overall budget. It's in its own area historically because it has involved use of fish to pay for it. None of the other programs have that. So either the DFO programs for the spawning ground enumeration or any other core programs, or our own, the DNA, the hydroacoustics program, in-season management, all of those things are funded from bilateral funds. The test fishing is funded by has historically been funded up until 2007 by use of fish, and only beginning in 2007 were separate funds made available to fund the test fishing program. I think that clarification is important. Mm-hmm. I think one other thing that I would add is under this environment, it's more difficult to, we have not made a case for additional test fisheries. So if you wanted another test fishery, one year in fact, in 2009, I specifically asked that we consider a west coast of Vancouver Island troll test fishery in the middle of 2009 because we weren't seeing the fish anywhere, and it would be useful to go a little bit seaward to see whether in fact there was anything out there. Give us a little bit more lead time, and it was basically turned down essentially because of funding issues and balancing that off against information needs.
Is it fair to say that there has been pressure to reduce test fishing costs since 2007?
Well, I guess I might be repeating myself, but whether it's use of fish or dollars, you're going to be asking yourself those questions about what information you need to run these test fisheries. So I would say yes, each year we within Canada and similarly within the US would be looking at what's required.
If I could have you turn to tab 5, which is CAN 013783, and it was to Mike Lapointe and Don Cole at the Commission. In this memo, you outline a number of options to reduce test fishing costs. You see that?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Why was this memo prepared?
Well, we had met with members of the Fraser panel, and it indicated Paul Ryle and Dave Cantillon, some of the technical committee members. I can't recall whether this was a telephone conference call. And what we were asked to review some of our core programs. First option that's outlined there is that we would start Area 20 later, and largely that was okay. We felt that was reasonable because of the small size of the return that was expected in 2007 for early Stewart, and that given there would be conservation concerns, it would not be unreasonable to start that later, and I think it started on July the 14th that year. So there were cost savings that came with that, and I've noted that there's minimal jeopardy given the forecast early Stewart sockeye. The Round Island gillnet would remain as July 10th, so I think we actually moved the Area 20 program to July 14 that year, but Round Island remained at July 10. Another one is to operate all Fraser panel approved test fisheries during August only. Potential concern was summer on sockeye. Felt that I would rather see, I felt we could get through the early part of the summer run with primarily gillnet test fishing information. But I emphasized that if we wanted to understand the Fraser River pink salmon return, we would need to carry that. Those test fisheries were very valuable in September, in particular because there is no escapement estimation program for Fraser River pink salmon, and the only way we can estimate the size of the total return of Fraser River pinks is with marine area assessment.
So were any changes made in reaction to that option?
Well, in fact, we did start those test fisheries on August 1st, if I recall. But that was largely because there was no abundance of sockeye early in those test fisheries, so we started them late. And that's generally something we typically do. I would prefer to see test fisheries start on some building abundance. If you don't see the building abundance in the gillnet test fisheries, these same test fisheries are costly to operate. It's prudent fiscally to delay those if the information is low on it. That's balanced against the need for the individual test fishermen involved to have an income. If we take too many days of test fishing away from them, they can't earn a living. The return does not justify their commitment, their financial commitment to the test fishery. The third one, operate the test fisheries every other day. I was dead set against this. I knew I couldn't sell it to the test fishermen. I knew, for example, for Area 20, the test fishermen there would not agree to it. Brian can probably comment as to whether he would agree to that. Test fisheries in the Fraser River, I noted we had no options. I think we need to assign a minimum wage, a minimum of $50,000 to this test fishery.
Were you introducing a new test fishery that year in the river?
We did. We wanted the test fishery at Mission was also, and I don't think at this time we'd identified it or discussed that, but I cannot recall that when the request for the Sumas test fishery was in place.
And just to go back to the beginning of this memo, you begin by saying that you had this meeting with Mr. Ryle and Mr. Cantillon and various members of the technical committee to discuss options provided to the panel and finance committee. And Mr. Ryle at that time indicated that no sale of fish was more likely than option 2. I'm not sure what option 2 was, based on discussion with the lawyers. Paul stated he would like to see a third option reflecting a reduction of test fishing programs. And Mr. Ryle, this was because you needed to find ways to reduce costs in the test fishing program. Isn't that fair?
Well, I don't know that it's fair to say it's reduced costs. We were looking at ways to what information is required. And so do we need to start the area 20 gill net later? Is that an option? So the overall impact of that would be, yes, it would reduce costs.
And that was, I take it, something that Canada was looking to do, because all of a sudden Canada was faced with having to fund all these programs when they hadn't in the past.
We had not funded them through dollars, that's correct.
Okay. And if you can turn to, sorry, I'd like that mark, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 372.
And then tab 6 is a memo of 2007, so same year. And it looks like there is, at this point, again, this is a memo from you, Mr. Cave, to Mr. Lapointe, and there was further consideration done of dropping certain test fisheries. And this is your response to those proposals. Why was this memo prepared, or do you remember the context of that discussion?
Well, there was a suggestion that some of the test fisheries, there was some redundancy that perhaps under this environment of funding could not be afforded or was not affordable. And so I felt then one of the suggestions was that the Area 13 test fishery did we need it? And I said, well, yes, we did, and we did in particular because it's a quantitative argument, but one that shows that we can reduce the uncertainty in our overall estimation. And this is before Catherine came on staff, so I sort of dug into my own documents and dug this out. That essentially the uncertainty is cut dramatically by having independent estimates of abundance. So, as the person who is involved with doing these estimates, I felt that it would be a real mistake to get rid of this test fishery because we use it to average the abundance estimates essentially. It doesn't just average the abundance estimates, it comes with increased certainty, or let's put it this way, reduced uncertainty is a more correct way of saying that. It reduces your uncertainty in the estimates, and so it gives us a tighter probability intervals when we're estimating run size.
And what happened as a result of that discussion, or whatever discussions followed your memorandum? Was the Area 13 dropped?
No, it continues, and Brian Asu is the test fisherman there, and it continues through 2010, and it's on our proposed program for 2011 as well.
All right, and was it changed? Was there a reduction in the test fishery activity in Area 13?
What was done was we had 2 test fishermen there, and it was felt that we had more flexibility by going to a single individual, and it would allow us to, if we had to restructure the test fishery, it would come with less effect on the income of the individual in part. And as I've mentioned, what doesn't come out here, and I'm sure Brian can speak to this better than I can, but we're starting to get to the point with fisheries in Canada and on Fraser River Sockeye where people are wondering whether they should continue to fish. And we need good people. They need to maintain their investment. They need to maintain their boat. They need to maintain their gear. And if you're not paying them enough from the test fishery and they don't get commercial opportunities, it comes to the point where they wonder whether it's worth them continuing. And so it comes down to income, and they do a job, and we have to pay them appropriately for the job they do, and on top of that, they have to maintain their investment.
All right, Mr. Askew, maybe I could just ask you to comment on that. Can a test fisher operate on a reduced schedule on every other day, or whatever, a reduction, 50% reduction as to what the current operations are that you're involved in?
Well, I certainly didn't like the every other day proposal. It's just really because of the gear that you've got. Leaving the seine net on the drum for a day, every other day just doesn't make any sense, and it's hard with the crew. They don't all live in Campbell River, and you've got to bring them in. So just the logistics. But the reduced part, I guess we've lived through that, Jim. I guess we've shortened up on the front end of the test fishery, and I guess somewhat on the back end too.
But the idea of cutting out every other day, which may make sense from a science perspective, is it a workable solution from a fisher perspective?
The every other day, I remember this being talked about previously, and no, it just didn't make sense.
Would you be able to continue operating as a test fisher if that was the option available to you?
Personally, I guess I wouldn't have any choice because I have the contract, but...
Would you negotiate a new contract on those terms?
And when Jim talks about, the reasons, too, behind what you're doing is the crew play a big part in all of this. It's very difficult to find a good crew nowadays with the way the whole industry has changed. And I'm not just talking about salmon. Salmon and herring both go together in a lot of our communities, and it's been a difficult time. Getting a good crew is really difficult, and you need it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cate, back to your memo. I'll just try and finish this memo before the lunch break.
I'd like to add one thing to, although when you go to every other day, you're losing a lot of information. You might say you can average in between, but it does result in an increase in the uncertainty in the estimates because you're interpolating between days. It's a loss of information.
Right. And I take it one of the goals that you have is to reduce uncertainties, not increase uncertainties.
Under this environment, I think I'm looking for more, not less.
Ms. Baker, could we take the break at this point?
Could I ask him just a couple of questions on this document and I'll be done? No?
I would prefer.
You've got to go. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hearing will now adjourn until 2 p.m.